So, this is the Guardians of Craft blog, where we speak to people who are involved in curating, very broadly defined, in a variety of areas. And I have the pleasure today of speaking with Sarah Forbes, who is the curator of the Museum of Sex. Sarah, thanks so much for joining me today.
Well, I'm happy to be participating.
So, for those listeners who are not familiar with the Museum of Sex, could you briefly tell us what the Museum of Sex is?
Absolutely. So the Museum of Sex actually opened in 2002, and we are at least we like to think of ourselves as a social, cultural, historical institution that focuses on the subject of sex and sexuality.
So, sorry, when did the museum open, and could you tell us a little bit about what its origin story is?
Absolutely. So the museum opened in 2002 here in New York, and I think, this was a very interesting time in New York City when a lot of the sexuality that was present was being sanitized. So, when the idea to make an institution dedicated to sexuality, really thinking of it along the lines of a Smithsonian of sex, many people they didn't know what that was going to be. They couldn't quite conceptualize of taking this topic and handling it in a academic but fun manner, and I think that was a kind of a difficult concept for people to wrap their minds around.
So, of all the cities in all the world, why open in New York?
Well, the museum's founder, Daniel Gluck, was based here in New York, and I think, there was that, chance of life that made it New York, and I think also New York, as an American city, has a huge history of sexuality and sexual artifacts, and it really seemed like a perfect place.
And has that been the case? Has it turned out well to be there?
I think the fact that we are still here 12 years later, and not just here but growing, I think is perfect evidence that, this was the right city, and we're doing the right kind of work that the patrons and the community are supporting.
So if I am correct, one of the first exhibits was called NYC Sex, How New York Transformed Sex in America. Am I right about that?
Yeah, so that was the inaugural exhibition, which actually took over the entire museum at the time. So much of the early museum staff came from the New York Historical Society, and it's a huge topic in itself, even just talking about New York's sexual past. So it was about a 3-gallery exhibition.
And so what were some of the things one might see in that exhibit?
Everything from the museum is very lucky to have brothel guides from the mid-1800s. So if you were a tourist visiting New York at that time, you could purchase one of these guides that would tell you where to go, not only for sexual services, but also to buy condoms, to buy anything that was deemed erotic. There were also, in this exhibition, art and artifacts from various sexual communities, and items that tried to weave together this history of individuals as well as the larger social issues that have taken place in the city.
So is the focus of the museum entirely historical, or is there also a focus on contemporary sexuality?
What we feel so lucky to be able to do is that sexuality, sex, is pretty much the largest topic you could ever hope to cover, and can really be accessed from so many different disciplines. So all of our exhibitions are different. Some of our exhibitions are, history-centric. Some are art-centric. Art could be, fine art from 100 years ago. It can be a contemporary artist working today. We also work with, a wide variety of scientists. So each exhibition has its own focus, its own energy, and then not only do we have, 4 to 5 exhibition spaces at any given time, but we rotate our exhibitions. So there's constantly something new being on display at the museum.
So may I geek out for a second?
Absolutely. That's the best way to be.
So I am, when I'm not doing the blog, I am a social psychologist here at the college. And so when you mentioned science, as you just did in passing in your last answer, my ears prick up. And so my students and I were recently reading some work by Meredith Chivers. and her colleagues, focusing on the differences between men and women in genital sexual responding, where, to make a long story short, they saw evidence of what they suggested was greater female flexibility in terms of what kinds of stimuli arouse them genitally. For men, it tended to be more about who was depicted in visual stimuli. So for heterosexual men, images of sexualized images of women were more arousing. For homosexual men, the opposite. For women, it was less about whether it was men or women depicted and more about what they were doing. So intercourse was more arousing than, say, masturbation or just watching someone nude exercising. I wonder if you have any sense of whether you've portrayed greater flexibility on the part of women in the images and sounds you've displayed, or if female patrons respond to what you show differently from how male patrons respond.
It's a very large question. For us to, particularly as curators creating the content, not necessarily always being in the gallery space, observing how people are interacting, from their entire visit. But I would say that the museum as a whole does attract a surprisingly large female demographic. Mm-hmm. So I would say it's close to, 55-60% is actually female visitors. Mm-hmm. So, you can chalk that up to so many different things. You can say that we create a welcoming environment, the way that we handle the subject matter, makes it more inviting. I think that there's so many theories of sexuality and arousal, and there's almost, you see these trends where, the male brain and the female brain are designated to be very different. Mm-hmm. And then somebody else writes a book that they're actually not as different as originally thought. Mm-hmm. And for me, and my background being more of a anthropology background, and the curatorial stance that I try to create is not necessarily taking a position either way, but presenting all of the information for people to try and, come to their own conclusions. We're not trying to dictate opinions on sex, mm-hmm. but to provide information that leads to discourse.
Do you have a target audience for whom you're aiming?
I wouldn't say we have a target audience. I would say our audience is just so vast. Mm-hmm. We are an 18-plus institution, so anyone over that age, can attend our exhibitions. But from there, it's everyone and anyone, because our subject matter is interesting to everyone and anyone.
So let's talk a little bit about some of your current exhibits. I just recently visited the website of the Museum of Sex, or is MoSex the abbreviation?
Yes, it is.
So
it's a cute little pet name.
Yes, so I visited the MoSex website. And at least at the moment, when you go there, you are immediately greeted by a rather odd image that seems, at least to my eye, to be part cowboy, part sea creature. And it's part mm-hmm. of the, is it pronounced Grimildos?
Yes, the Grimildos, the exhibition installation. And, so that's a great example of some of the diversity of the project. So I came across an artist. Her name is Eddie Ferrer, 5 years ago. She's a Peruvian artist, was making, at the time it's called Los Grimildos, and they're half animal, half mythological creatures, and they're supposed to represent the marginal figures in the red light district. Mm-hmm. And it's kinetic theater, part puppetry. They're really these magical installations. But, came across her 5 years ago, and it's taken that many years to be able to bring her here to the Museum of Sex. So that's, this artist who's working today, and then another exhibition that we have is called The Sex Lives of Animals, which is all about the non-reproductive sex that occurs in the animal kingdom, the fact that animals engage in every sex act that people do and beyond. They engage in oral sex, anal sex, group sex, masturbation. They've even been known to make sex toys. And so that's an exhibition where we worked with a panel of about 12 academic advisors, evolutionary biologists, primatologists. And so they're, very different kinds of projects, and that you can find both of those within our institution walls is part of why I love my job.
And you just made an allusion to tool use, but tool use research on speed. It sounds like I didn't realize that animals had been found to make sex toys. Do you recall which species have been found to do this?
Yeah, it's multiple. One example that I love is, scientists were observing male orangutans, and they took leaves and they poked a hole in the leaf, and they put it over their penises and pulled the leaves up and down to stimulate their shafts.
So when you're featuring work like that, and in particular I'm asking about the exhibit depicting non-human animal sex, what do you want your patrons to take away from that exhibit? Is it a sense of our kinship as a species with non-human animals? Do you want our views of humanity to change? Or is your goal something different from either of those?
I think, that exhibition, part of the goal is to present information that has really not had another public forum. In creating that exhibition, we were really, we dubbed it that we were creating a new natural history. These are not the things that appear at your typical natural history museum. They are things that are, even difficult to dig out of the scientific archive. And bringing that kind of information to the forefront, where we can see that in the natural world, there is a huge amount of diversity of behaviors. And for things, we have one section on same-sex animal couplings. Within the natural world, there are over 500 animal species that have same-sex relationships, and science deems this a natural fact. And so, we're not trying to overly correlate, but to show that there are all kinds of actions that happen within nature, and people can draw their own conclusions from there.
So correct me if I'm wrong, but it sounds as if a key part of your overarching curatorial philosophy is featuring work that otherwise wouldn't have a home in the world of museums. Is that right?
Very much so. I think much of what we have in our permanent collection, which actually has over 15,000 artifacts, much of what we show within our walls doesn't get shown in other places. And if it does get shown, it doesn't necessarily get presented with context. So, for instance, we'll get calls from, regular people, and they'll have come across items. Let's say, their grandfather has passed away, and they're cleaning out his belongings, and they find a stack of pin-up magazines from the 1940s. What to do with these kind of objects? For a long time, people's discomfort with sex and sexuality, they would throw these things into the garbage. And, that breaks my heart. These are artifacts, and these are things that help us understand various time periods. And so, thankfully, over the years, we've become a place that people can call, and they've found these items, and we can help preserve them, in the same manner which other museums do, and also display them. And so that ability for items that so often have been destroyed is definitely a part of what our mission is.
So, as I have one more question about your curatorial philosophy, and this one I think is inspired by what I see right now as I look at the Museum of Sex blog. The second entry, and my students will love hearing me say this, oh my God, Becky, look at his cock. So there's a lot of irreverence there. Is irreverence also a part of your curatorial? I mean, I recognize that the blog is not the same thing as the exhibition, but I wonder, is irreverence a part of your curatorial philosophy as well?
I wouldn't necessarily. I mean, I think irreverence is great, and I think there are particular spaces for that. I do think that, our social media and our blogs, we have the ability to do that in a different way than we can within an exhibition. But I would say my curatorial philosophy is to create exhibitions that are just as entertaining as they are educational. I think that when people are enjoying their experience, they actually learn more and they take more with them. And particularly since we hope to inspire discourse, the more that they, digest from the exhibitions, they will take that into their lives and into their interactions with other people and their conversations.
Then in that spirit, will you tell us a little bit about the Funland or Funland exhibit, and what you want patrons to learn from that.
So the Funland is a relatively new exhibition here. It was created through a commission with a UK artist, Bumpus and Parr.
Mm-hmm.
And, it's wonderful that they combined their artistic sensibilities with an academic who specializes in, the kind of the eroticism of, the carnival, of the
This is Professor Vanessa Toulmin.
Exactly. So, you have these, there's nothing other to call them but fun, art installations. There's a boob bouncy castle. So think of a bouncy castle of childhood that is, there's breasts of all different shapes and colors within it, and you can bounce and, have this very freeing experience. So you're having that tactile, interactive museum experience, balanced with a little bit of this historical context of why the fairground has, this long history of being an erotically charged space.
And so I grew up in Arkansas, and so it may be that in the deep South, maybe our fairgrounds were a little different from the ones that others grew up with, but I don't remember it being a place of eroticism. Was I missing something?
I think that, whenever you have this kind of idea of wonder, of voyeurism, of, spectacle, you're having bodies typically on display, and, this legacy of the, quote-unquote freak show.
Right.
There is that charged sexuality. I think, sometimes, we've interacted with many of these spaces as children, but, kind of stepping back a bit further, that, you're going into a secret tent and you don't know what's going to happen. It's a lot of the similar kind of sexual charge that many people kind of enjoy and maybe bring into their kind of adult sensibilities.
And before we leave the carnival world of Funland, tell us about the Tunnel of Love.
The Tunnel of Love is a mirror maze. So thinking, taking that typical structure of the maze that we know of the fair, but as you journey through it, the goal is to find this representative G-spot.
Mm-hmm. And it is really there. It's not a cruel trick where you look and you look and you look and you never find it.
You will find something.
I must confess I haven't been to Most Sex yet, but if I want to get there and see Funland, how much longer do I have?
That will be through early next year.
So maybe I'll try to convince my family that we shouldn't do Christmas in Arkansas. We should do Christmas in Manhattan and stop by Most Sex. We'll see how eager they are to go for that.
It'll definitely be a memorable Christmas. There will be lots of conversation afterwards.
And actually, as I ponder the prospect of bringing my family from Arkansas and Missouri and Texas, so centered around the Bible Belt, up to Most Sex, I wonder if you've ever considered any touring exhibitions, and in particular, if you could imagine touring through the Bible Belt, what would you want to bring there?
We are absolutely open to the idea of touring our exhibitions. I think all of our exhibitions hit on different notes. It would be more that I wouldn't want to just take one exhibition. I'd want to take maybe parts of many that we've done. And, we have a space, a long-running space. It's called our Spotlight on the Permanent Collection, which is a constantly rotating space. But it's through that space we're able to feature, individual artifacts that have had historical narratives. So, for instance, we have one of our prized possessions is a anti-onanism or anti-masturbation device from the late 1800s that was produced in Paris. And the fact that only a little over a century ago we would force little boys to be wearing this kind of object to prevent, masturbation. It's not that long ago.
Self-harm, as it were.
Self-harm, that it was going to cause insanity and physical deformity. And, when you look at this kind of object in person, that's what the power of the museum is that you get to see this object and really kind of absorb what it might have been like at a different time period and what our attitudes for sex and sexuality were.
So we only have a few more minutes, so I'm going to have to limit myself to just 2 or 3 more questions. But one thing that I'm curious about is it's an issue that arises from an interview I did not too long ago with Kata Kolwitz of the Gorilla Girls. So for those who aren't familiar with them, A, they should scroll up in my blog because I've posted the interview there, but B, the Gorilla Girls is a feminist activist group that has, among other things, crusaded against sexism in the art world. And one of their most famous flyers, and really a campaign built around it, focused on sexism at the New York Metropolitan Museum of Art, the Met, where women were less likely to be among the artists featured, but much more likely to be depicted as nude models. And so the catchphrase was, does a woman have to be naked to get into the Met? And I wonder to what extent you self-consciously, as you curate, guard against biases, whether it's sexism or heteronormativity or other biases, or do you is it not even conscious at all?
I think, one of my goals is to show the diversity that exists within whatever topic it is that we're presenting. That's part of, and I think diversity exists in many different capacities. So we try to bring that forth in the exhibitions we create.
So I love stories. In fact, I run a storytelling event here in Lewiston, Auburn. Don't be surprised if you get an invitation to come tell a story sometime.
I love it.
And I have you on record saying that, so now you have to say yes. As you look back over your work at MoSex, I wonder if you have a brief story that comes to mind that's really revealing, either, say, a really funny story or perhaps a really moving story that you can recall.
I think for me, it's not one particular story. It's a story that's kind of been replicated time and time again for me I've been here for 10 years working at the Museum of Sex. It's whenever we're able to preserve a collection that would otherwise be destroyed. So, for instance, I was called once by it was a landlord, and the person living in the apartment had passed away. And I'm in New York City. I was able to go and see what it was. And the landlord, he was like, "Oh, there's this pile of porn in the corner. That's what you want." And, took a look of it. And, it was just some pages torn out of some magazines, some VHS from the 80s. It was interesting. But when I looked around this apartment and I saw the library of the man who had lived in this, apartment, it was this incredible LGBT library that he'd amassed over years and years, books that are, that were not, published on wide scale, maybe there was just a handful of things. And so there are hundreds and hundreds of books that I, put my focus on in the preservation of. And I was able to tell that story at a conference here in New York at CUNY. They have a conference every year. And just, that emotional quality of being a part of that preservation is one of the things that I really value in this profession.
So what's coming up next at MoSex?
Well, we're actually in an exciting, at least for me, curatorial moment where, we're crafting, many different proposals and trying to figure out what our next exhibitions will be over the next couple of years. And it's, always trying to find that balance of, a little bit of art, a little bit of science, a little bit of history. So I'm in my curatorial fun land of being able to do research and reading and reaching out to a wide diversity of people.
Well, it has been a real pleasure, and I want to make sure that all listeners know that if they look just below this sound clip on the blog page, they will see a link to the Museum of Sex website where they can get more information on current exhibitions and, importantly, how to find you when they are next in New York. And I certainly look forward to visiting MoSex the next time that I am in New York. And whether there or at my storytelling event, I hope to have a chance to shake your hand. For now, Sarah Forbes, curator of the Museum of Sex, it has been a real delight. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.